we heard Prime Minister say, Madam Chair, that, education has a third amount of budget in the Constitution, that it gets very, very little from the national budget. But if we examine the Constitution, education has the lion's share of the national budget. In fact, it is the first priority of the Constitution, and the Congress has no power to actually change that. But more than that, let's look the stand coming from opening opposition. What do we actually want? What we want is to strike a balance between courses which are economically profitable and courses which have a social function in society. We do this in two prongs, which A is we continuously subsidize quality education at the primary and secondary level. This is a considerable point coming from government bench, and you can't expect opposition to argue that we want to remove budget in the secondary and the elementary level. But more than that, here's where the debate actually happens. Second prong is, but when these students go to the college level, where should subsidy be placed? On economically profitable courses, on courses that have a social function, or both? And stand of opposition is simple, that government should have equal level of priority between both economically profitable courses and courses that have a social function. That is where opposition enters this debate. Because argumentation we heard coming from Prime Minister were mostly revolved around the fact that education is a very important thing that government should continue to subsidize it. That's something we are ready to concede to, because we can't expect opposition to actually say that education isn't important. That's an unfair burden being placed on opposition bench, Madam Chair, and members of this House. So the debate actually goes this way. Which should the government prioritize? Economically profitable courses, courses that have a social function, or both? I, as a leader of opposition, will prove to you that ultimately it is government's responsibility to subsidize both kinds of courses, Madam Chair, and members of this most august House. And I argue that on my first level of argumentation, that choosing, Madam Chair, and prioritizing one course over the other limits opportunities for both the government and the people. And why is that? Because education, Madam Chair, ultimately is about intelligent decision making. But once government intervenes, Madam Chair, and prioritizes one course over the other, what we do is we send a message that ultimately this is the path we want you to take. That we do not want you to consider other options or other vocations. That the goal of you as a person and as a citizen of the country is to be economically profitable, and that's it. Sit down. So what we do is we actually create a state that limits choices. And what right does it have to do that? Because ultimately that's a value of intervention on a level of abrasive interference of people's rights to choose, Madam Chair, and members of this most august House. Because we should examine how limitation actually happens. When you limit funds to these courses that are, not necessarily economically profitable, like journalism or mass communications, what you do is you remove funds from these courses. So what happens is that these courses become expensive and are only available in private universities and colleges, and only available to those who actually have the money to get these courses, Madam Chair, and members of this most august House. But because, a lot of people won't be able to get this, these courses will eventually die. And what government has to concede to is that these courses perform a very important social function. That the economy of a certain country is not divorced from other social structures, Madam Chair, and members of this most august House. That government's responsibility now becomes to strike a balance between economic profitability and the holistic formation of social infrastructures, Madam Chair, and members of this most august House. Remember, we cannot live in an economic-driven society, because ultimately these people have to be formed holistically, Madam Chair. And all these other courses, like liberal arts, food technology, AB English, perform a certain primordial social function that, when is no longer present in society, would lead to economic collapse, Madam Chair, and members of this most august House. Because let's examine this. The economy exist in a vacuum. It is not divorced from other social structures. Rather, the economy is dependent and intertwined, Madam Chair, with other social structures. Because even if you have a free market and an economically driven population, if you do not have the media to, actually check and balance these kinds of economies, what happens is your economy now collapses. And even if you have a free market, Madam Chair, and you don't have, food technologists or other healthcare providers, because they're not really economically driven courses, what happens now is some of your people get sick and your economically will eventually collapse as well. What happens, Madam Chair, if you have a free market, you have an economically active population, but you do not have teachers or people taking up liberal arts, Madam Chair, and members of the focus house. What happens is you have an uneducated population, so your economy will no longer be sustainable, Madam Chair, and members of this focus house. Even if you consider the creative arts, leisure, entertainment courses,